Greetings, gamers! Welcome to my fourth tier list in the making, and that would happen to be Fire Emblem 15 Shadows of Valentia Echoes. It is one of my favorite games, but not because mechanically it's better than others, but because it gave me a lot of hope of the franchise that remakes can be done without being totally bastardized, which is kind of insane to think of in a modern day, especially given the fact that one of the most beloved parts of Fire Emblem, the Arcanea series, at least for the series developers, the creation of Fire Emblem, the beginning of Fire Emblem was bastardized in FE12. It's kind of weird to me that that was something that was allowed, especially with the whole Chris venture. I'm not going to be going too far into that because my opinions and views are pretty well known, at least on this channel, and should be at least understood in the sense that I don't have really a care for the way that the series is going. Luckily for me, the older games aren't going anywhere. And regardless of whether you have a console or the capacity to play the games or buy the games, you will be able to play them for the rest of all time. If the internet exists, computers exist, you're going to be able to play them, which is pretty darn crazy, pretty darn cool. Now, beginning my FE 15 tier list, I have to demonstrate the tiers. So I have S, A, B, C, D. Outstanding, exceptional, above average, mediocre, forgettable. Unfortunately, every unit that's in C tier and below in this game, I either never use or I find you are downright hampering yourself by using. I will grant that some of the people that I'm going to be putting in certain tiers would probably be considered higher tier because Dread Fighter is typically considered like an automatic win, which I personally understand. Dread Fighters are insane in this game. Apotrope is the best skill in this game, period. I would say that the only skills that come close to as good are like Slayer, and there's a few other instances that I can think of, like skills that are pretty decent and could be in the same realms, you could say. But the fact of the matter is that there is no pre-promoted Dread Fighter in this game, which means that every one of your units that is not a Dread Fighter but can become a Dread Fighter has to get there. And my issue with that is that if the unit is not close or doesn't have the utility, I don't particularly think that that unit should just be automatically thrown in something like S tier, just because he has access to Dread Fighter. Just throwing that out there. First and foremost, the unit to speak of, Alm. Alm is an immediate S tier outstanding unit. In fact, I think he's one of few in this game. This game has a lot of forgettable units, unfortunately, a lot of mediocre units. And the reason why is because there's not a lot of use for like overwhelming your enemy with a bunch of units or spamming units. And what's crazy is that this game only allows you to bring 10 units in dungeons. So the issue is that if you're at all like me and only want to use a single roster for your playthrough, that means that when you're playing Alm's party, you're only going to use 5 units. When you're playing Celica's party, you're only going to use 5 units. So that you can only focus on 10 units total in the game, so that you only have 10 units in all of the dungeons maximum. And this unfortunately leaves Echoes with a little bit of a problem in my humble opinion, and that is that I typically gravitate to a certain select few of units, and that's pretty much it. S tier units are always on my team. Alm, of course, he is one of the main lords of this game, the most important of the main lords of this game, and the most powerful. He is probably one of your most powerful units, especially when he gets himself the Royal Sword, which is one of the cooler preferential weapons, in my humble opinion, that any lord of the series has ever gotten, and that's specifically because of Double Lion. Double Lion is absolutely insane. The fact that it also has send scale and deify means that I just hazard the question, why would anybody use the Falchion over the Royal Sword? The Royal Sword is just so much better. Double Lion, every single double attack skill that turns a weapon into a brave weapon in this game is busted beyond belief, especially because there are no actual brave weapons in this game, despite the game calling killer weapons brave weapons. Now, you do need Alm for the KO on the final boss, but there are other ways to cheese that boss, so technically that's not just his utility, though it is a big portion, in my humble opinion, on a regular, casual, or normal playthrough. Now, moving on to the very next unit, I have Gray. So Gray is going to be in B tier. In fact, so is Tobin and Cliff. Now, the reason why all three of these are going straight into B tier, I could probably have a full-on discussion about all of the villagers in this game for hours on how they are able to be utilized, what classes they can turn into, what are their best classes, what are their favorite classes, what classes I like putting them in, their spells, their utility, so on and so forth. None of them learn very notable spells. Cliff is the best mage here if you turn him into a mage. All of them are fantastic bow knights. In fact, I would just flat out say that the best class for all the villagers is bow knight. Just flat out. If you put a unit in bow knight, I think bow knight is actually the best class in this game. That might be a little bit of a hot take because a lot of people love dread fighters because of apotrope, and it is, like I said, one of the best skills in the game. Bow knights are the best unit in this game, bar none. This is the best game that bows ever existed in. There is no better game. In fact, I would even say Gaiden, with some of its lesser restrictions, because it has less restrictions about bows than Echoes does, and it has more range on certain bows, especially for a character like Alm. However, the fact of the matter is that bows in this game have skills. And these combat arts, these skills, are insane. Some of them are absolutely just you just don't want to pass them up. Some of them are just instant crits or double attacks, this, that, and the other. It is insane to me how powerful bow knights are. The reason why I'm putting them in B tier is because none of their statistics are good at the start. None of their growth rates are good. They don't really have good utility outside of being bow knights. And it takes a very, very long time to get them to bow knight. It takes them a very long time to get to anything. And the reason why that is because they're villagers. Villagers, this game has 3 tiers of classes. Technically 4, if you count the DLC classes. But it goes villager, and then another tier. Well, actually, no. This game has 5 tiers, doesn't it? A little bit off there. Villager is not a tier. It's before the 3-tier system. And then there's technically a 5th tier. So, pardon my brashness there. It would be villager, and then they would go into like bow fighter or whatever, archer, sniper, and then bow knight. And then I'm not going to count the DLC. I'm just not going to count the DLC classes. I find them to be a little bit abysmal. They're just unnecessary, in all honesty. The next unit I want to rate in this game is Faye. So Faye is an instant S tier for me, if you make her a cleric. If she's anything else, I feel like she's probably a C tier. Literally. Doesn't matter what you make her into, she is a C tier. Maybe even D tier. Because she's just far and away less viable or less good than Tobin, Gray, or Cliff concerning combat. So what you want from her is you want the utility. She's the only character in the game that gets a new. That means she is your dancer. She is your only dancer. And that's only something that you get after she's reached a very high level. Now, granted, I will say that high level is kind of a barrier to entry, right? But Faye, again, is the only one who gives this utility. And I just cannot understate how absolutely powerful it is in Fire Emblem. Even with the fact that it costs 24 HP, if I'm not mistaken, to cast anew, it is still one of the most powerful, most broken things in this game due to the fact that she's the only one who can get it. I do like giving her certain things that kind of make it so that regardless of her using this, she's going to be okay. So a good example of this would be the Draco Shield. A lot of people say it's too difficult to get the Draco Shield in the early game from the good old boss himself, the conniving, the evil, the violent man, the big old fat man himself, uh, who has the Draco Shield. But the problem is that it's actually not hard to get if you use the Levin Sword on a somewhat trained Alm, and you pelt him with a bunch of like arrows and stuff like that. It's actually not hard at all to get, at all. It's a bit tedious, especially because you have to keep from KOing Slade, but it's not at all impossible. And once you get the Draco Shield and you put it on a unit like Faye, because she's only ever going to be used for healing. You're not going to use for combat. You're not going to use her like for physical combat for sure if you're putting her in a clear class. She gets insane defenses, basically becomes unkillable, can use the Anu once it comes to the point where she's earned it, and then she's healing every turn because the Draco Shield also heals you. It's actually kind of insane how powerful that item is in conjunction with your magical units like Faye, because they don't really need weapons or items of the sort. Now, the very next unit to talk about is Lucas. Now, I actually think Lucas is an obvious D tier unit. I think the only reason why I would dare put him in C tier is just because for the early game, he can really help, especially on the harder difficulty, to alleviate some issues of your starting party's lack of combative strength and defensive power. Alm is basically your only good unit in the early game. Only. When it comes to combat at all. He's the only one. And Lucas isn't even really good either, but he does offer, like I said, a little bit more combat, a little bit more defensive utility. You can add that to your team. He's pretty good in the start, but I typically drop him because, unfortunately, Barons aren't that great. And what's crazy is they eventually get something that makes it so that bows do less damage to them, but not magic. And because their speed is typically lacking, a lot of your Barons just have absolute struggles in the late game. It's one of the reasons why a lot of people say Dread Fighters are the best classes in this game, because they take no damage from magical units regardless of the resistance, and they don't ever get doubled. Unfortunately, Lucas is just stuck. He is your first Armor Knight and not really a great one. Now, Silk is kind of a very interesting case. I want to put her in S tier because of her utility. Silk has an amazing invoke skill. She has the best invoke skill in the game, in my humble opinion, and that is Dread Fighters. So you can literally not use a Dread Fighter, but still have 8 Dread Fighters at your command, at your whim, just by having a leveled Silk. I want to put her in an S for this because these Dread Fighters are not only good fodder, they're actually pretty strong because of their inability to basically be killed by magic. I think I'm going to put her in A tier though. Now, she does come with Warp, which is still good in this game. She does come with Seraphim eventually. She does receive these, and she also receives Expel. Expel is actually a very underrated spell in itself. The reason why I don't put her in S tier is just because I feel like certain of the units that I would put in S tier are a little bit better than Silk. Granted, it's kind of a little bit of a tough one for me. I'm struggling whether or not I want to put her in S or A. And I think I'm just going to leave her in A because she is an exceptional unit. She's not really ever going to be good for combat until she's promoted and does have Seraphim, because unfortunately Nosferatu is kind of not great. It's both good and not good at the same time. It only has 60 accuracy, and that accuracy can't be really changed except for supports. So in realistic concept, she basically has a coin toss of hitting a unit. And that's not really great, considering the fact that it oftentimes leads to hers and other clerics' deaths if you're trying to Nosferatu tank. It is interesting in that it's the only spell in the game that doesn't really cost any to cast because you heal with it. But and every cleric gets it. It's just the issue is that it's not really something that I would put in her utility. And because Seraphim is a very late thing, Warp is basically what you're getting this unit for. And believe me, Warp is very good in this game. It's just that it's not as good in this game as in some other games because you don't really have many chapters where it's like a siege chapter. Most chapters in this game are a route. So warping is not as helpful as you would think. At least in retrospect. It's good. It's useful. It can help you get to certain things a little bit quicker, but it's not something that's absolutely necessary. Do I still use her? 9 times out of 10, I still use Silk. In fact, I typically use 3 healers for my entire party, maybe 4, and Silk is usually just a staple because she's just so darn good with everything that she has to offer. Now, when it comes to Clyde, Clyde is unfortunately going to go into the exact same tier as Lucas. I don't think the mounted units in this game are all that good. They're good in certain maps, and they are definitely useful. It's not that they're bad. It's just that the issue is that, especially in the early game, Clyde isn't really that strong. And leveling him up really won't give you much of anything except for a decent combat unit with decent movement. And you would almost say, but Gamerman, don't you want movement in this game, particularly because this game has pretty large maps? And I would say to you, yeah, you kind of do want some reasonable movement units. And I'm not saying they're bad. He is just particularly not a good example of this. I would say he's just Lucas on a horse. Does give him a little bit better utility eventually, but in the early game, not so much. And then we have good old Claire. So Claire is your only early game flyer, or the only flyer that you have access to in the early game, unless you promote Faye into a Pegasus Knight. But like I said before, she would immediately be D tier or C tier if you did something other than Cleric, in my humble opinion. In fact, I'd probably put her in F tier, which I don't even have on here, but I'd probably do that just because you're missing out on the best, literal best utility in the game in Anu. So Claire is actually not that good. She's not really ever going to be good. She doesn't have good strength. She doesn't have good strength growth. She's not really got flyer utility because there is no rescue or drop in this game. There's really nothing that she needs to reach in the early game with her flying. The maps in this game are very old and antiquated and not well designed. But that's because they are made from the Gaiden maps. And because of this, oftentimes they're just big and open with like single choke points, like bridges and so on and so forth. And sure, you can fly over that, but most of your on-foot units can just walk over like rivers and whatnot, albeit with a very slow movement. She doesn't really offer anything there. Once she gets to a Falcon Knight and she has Slayer, she's pretty good then against terrors. The problem is that that's not enough of utility, in my humble opinion, to say that she is a good unit. I would say she's on the level of Clyde. I would maybe put them both in B tier as above average for the thought that they're better than Lucas trained. But at the start, I don't really think they offer really anything that Lucas doesn't. I really don't. And that's going to sound kind of weird because they both have pretty good movement. But again, this game doesn't focus on movement or going places or seizing this or seizing that or whatever. It just doesn't. And the thing about that is that what that means is that for units that don't really offer any kind of utility other than a little bit of extra movement, it's kind of a sad shame for them. The very next unit I would say I'm going to put on this list would be Luther. I halfway want to put this guy in D tier. And the reason why I do is because I feel like he is just a forgettable unit. There is pretty much nothing that he offers to the table that's really great. So he has a bunch of really decent mage spells, and they can be used to great effect. I'm not going to deny that. In my humble opinion, all of the female magic users are just better than the male magic users, and it's because of Seraphim. Seraphim is so good. It's good against both terrors and not, but it's especially good against terrors because it's effective against them. Seraphim is amazing. If you don't have Seraphim, there's something wrong with your move pool. And the issue is that Luther doesn't really have anything other than just some spells to offer to the table, and you could have 3 mages by this point. Actually, technically 5 if you're counting Silk and Cleric Fae. And though I'm not saying he's bad. I don't think he's totally bad or unusable. He's just forgettable in my case because I don't really care to use him. I don't think he's all that functionally good. Now, when it comes to a unit that's actually pretty decent, I would have to say that that goes to Delthea. Delthea is a much better mage than Luther, in my humble opinion. I think she's going to go in B tier above average. The only utility that she has is Rewarp. Rewarp is cool. Her and only one other unit in this game gets Rewarp. So I would say that's pretty cool utility. Being able to teleport yourself pretty much anywhere, but it's not really the same as like a witch. She doesn't get to move again after she teleports. So she's basically supposed to be like a witch. And the other unit that has rewarp is implied like a witch also. But the issue is they're not like witches. They don't get to move after teleport. So it's cool, it's useful, but it can oftentimes just put Delthea in a bad situation. Delthea, though, has some of the most powerful spells in the game. She's got Ragnarok, she's got Aura, she's got powerful spells. She has Seraphim. So when it comes down to it, she actually has some very powerful magic dealing damage. It's just that besides that, she doesn't really have utility, in my humble opinion. Now, when it comes to Python and Forsyth are both going in D tier. They're both going in D tier. So, Python is a bow unit, and you would think that would automatically make him good in my book because bow knights are pretty darn great. In this game, you don't get hardly any bow units besides, I want to say there's only 2, right? You only get Leon and Python are the only bow units you get that are promoted into bow units. You have to make all of your villagers into bow units. Granted, that's what I do. Greycliff and Tobin, I always might make bow units. They're always bow units. So the fact of the matter is that Python isn't really adding anything to this by this point. He's not bad, and once he becomes a bow knight, he's actually fantastic, but you have to make him a bow knight. And I don't give anybody any particular bias in this game just because of the class that he goes into. It's more or less like the utility, the power, the capability, and again, Python is just forgettable. Forsyth is literally Lucas, but joins later. And I find that to be kind of heinous for him because he's just not great. He's really just not great. Now, a good unit to speak of, Zeke. Zeke is going to go in immediate S tier. In fact, so is Matilda. So for different reasons, right? Zeke is far and away more the combatively powerful paladin, gold knight, I should say. Whereas Matilda isn't even promoted to a gold knight, but her stats are kind of close to the rest of the gold knights in the game on like recruitment. You do get, I believe, 2 gold knights in the game, if I'm not mistaken, that are already promoted to gold knights. And Zeke is one of them. Zeke is actually really strong. He's really powerful. He's one of the better pre-promotes in this game. Matilda as well. She's one of the better pre-promotes in this game, but for different reasons. She's very, very magically tanky. I would actually hazard to say that Matilda is one of the better units that you get in the game, bar none, just because she is a class that has great movement, that can use the Gradivus, and also has good resistance. This is not something I can understate. Resistance is so rare and uncommon in this game, just like it is in the Arcanea games. So if you have resistance, you should automatically be put a little bit above the rest when it comes to that little bit of utility, because the magic in this game hits very hard. And not only does it hit very hard, you typically with a single unit can't tank more than a single hit, especially around this point in the game. You're fighting units that are just insane. And having a unit that has good resistance and good combat is pretty good, and good movement. I love Zeke. I love Matilda for this. I think they're both good units. I think technically Matilda could probably, in fact, I'm probably going to go ahead and move her down to A tier. I don't think she's exactly on par with somebody like And the only reason why Zeke is up there is because he's just a pre-promoted gold knight. He is fourth tier, right? Um, or third regular tier if you're not counting villagers, and already can use every good weapon in the game, has some amazing utility in his movement, his defense, his offense. Everything is pretty darn good about him. Now, Tatiana, S tier. Tatiana is the only unit in the entire game that learns Fortify. The only unit. And what's kind of insane about that is Fortify is so abruptly powerful in this game. Being able to heal your whole party, especially when most of your party are constantly taking damage due to multiple hits from attacks on every realm. The issue is that this game doesn't really have a lot of what you would consider cover or like concealment for combat, and you're just going to get fought on every turn. Most of the maps are open. You have very open like areas. Most of the enemies are placed in such a way that you're going to be attacked by more than one. Fortify is insanely good, insanely good. Now she does have physics, she does have warp, so there's other things like Seraphim as well that she gains that make her a good unit otherwise. But I think Fortify is her number one utility here, and it's the reason why I would put her in S tier. In fact, I would say that she's pretty well on par with Silk. They're probably like interchangeable, right? She could probably go in A, Silk could probably go in S. They could interchange a bit. I just value Fortify that much because the Invoke for Silk, I do like Invokes and I do like Expel, but I don't think Invoke is enough to put Silk into S tier, even though her Invoke is the best in the game. In fact, if I was rating the Invokes on a tier rating, Silk would be the only one that has S tier. Everybody else would be like B or below. I don't even think there'd be an A. That's how much of a difference invoked dread fighters are in comparison to others. It's actually kind of crazy how that is. Mycin. So Mycin is in a similar position to Zeke, but the difference is that Mycin joins very much late into the game, as well as doesn't have good growths or like really anything other than his base statistics, and his statistics are pretty good. They're pretty good. They're pretty much on par with like Zeke and Matilda. They're pretty close. I just don't think he is S tier because of where he joins, and not only where he joins, because you only get him basically for the last part of the game. It's also due to the fact that he's not going anywhere with his growth. He's very good. He's actually probably the best pre-promote if you're just counting bases, but you also have to look at things like availability, where he's coming from, what he's offering to the table. Usually I don't deploy Mycin because I've worked on so many other units. I'm not going to wait for Mycin. Like I said before, I typically only use 5 units per party. And on Alm's route, as you can see here, there's a lot to choose from. This is all Alm's route. I haven't even gotten to Celica's route. So typically I always, of course, have to use Alm, and then I use Faye, and I use Zeke and Tatiana. And then I really only have room for a single other unit. And if I'm being honest, it's really a hard decision, because you've got Silk, which is pretty fantastic, but you've also got one of the villagers. Typically I go with Gray because he's got really good physical strength growth rates, but for like a Bow Knight. And it's not like a great lineup, but it's pretty decent. And sometimes I even go with all 5 of the S tier, and then I'll go with like maybe Matilda or Silk. Sometimes Mycin if I'm feeling pretty crazy. And typically what I do is, regardless of what way I go, I always use Gray, Tobin, and Cliff until I replace those units. Because like I said, I typically only do 5 units from each party in the end game, or like in my final party, and I bench the rest. So it just kind of depends. And the issue is that because of the way that I play this game, due to like the 10 character limit, and there being a lot more than 10. In fact, there being 17 on Alm's party alone, it's kind of a little bit difficult to choose. It's one of the reasons why when I look at somebody in C tier or D tier, these characters are never picked. I never pick C tier or D tier. In fact, the only reason why I'm putting Lucas, Clive, and Claire in C tier rather than D tier, rather than forgettable, is just because if you do use them, and I'm not going to be totally biased against them just because I don't particularly use them, I do think that they are better than Python, Luther, or Forsyth. Now, when it comes to the B tier, overall, the reason why these folks are in B tier is because typically I use them, but I also just shelf them. Delphia is one of those units that it's hard for me to find a place for her, because besides rewarp, she has no utility. And like I said, that's not exactly exceptional utility. So this is the end of Alm's tier list. And moving on to Celica. Celica is also an instant S tier. She is almost as good as Alm. And most of that boils down to the fact that she has a lot of combative utility and like staff utility, Seraphim, things like that Alm does not have. Just flat out. Alm is still the far and away better unit in combat, but she does have utility. If we were just talking about pure combat, I actually think Celica would be somewhere in the A tier. But if we're counting all of her utility, especially with the fact that Seraphim is just so good, especially in the early game of her route, I have to declare that she is an S tier unit. Now, when it comes to May and Bowie, I would say that both of these are C tier units. They're mages. They're good for what they are. They're technically potentially B tier because you only have them, Celica and Jenny, in the very start. But my problem is that they're not as great as other units, humbly, and particularly in Celica's party. Jenny, I would put in B tier because she does have some interesting utility, right? She has Expel. She has other staff-related utilities, especially going along the cleric side, that really help your team and assert that you don't need just damage, you need a lot of utility. And she helps with that in the early game of Celica's route. I actually find a lot of Celica's route's characters to be very lackluster and to be be kind of like low on the totem pole of like good units. Saber is not one of them. Saber is an A tier unit. Saber is probably the best unit in the game to turn into a Dread Fighter. And that's because he's so quickly obtained in Celica's route. And he's so vital. So vital. He basically performs the same role that Lucas does for Celica's route, except he's actually a good unit, especially when trained. And he doesn't have competition with like Alm, Gray, Tobin, or Cliff, whom, if you do promote all three of those units to Bowknights, Lucas might as well be an F tier at that point, because Bowknights are just that powerful. Saber is pretty good. I actually really love his recruitment, that you have to give away Celica's Golden Dagger, but you can literally just take the Golden Dagger back. I find that to be really funny. He's a good user of it, but the Golden Dagger actually is a weapon in which you can forge to make Celica's namesake, the beloved Zofia. And the weapon, her preferential weapon itself, is just really good. It's something that once she obtains, and it's kind of hard to obtain, but you can use like the merchants, the traveling merchants, to kind of bolster her gold supply, because Alm's party gets a lot more items for gold than Celica does, as well as Alm's party gets more gold. So Celica's party is quite a bit more poor, but you can kind of like go back and forth with these merchants, and it's really cool. And let alone the merchants, once she does get the beloved Zofia, she has one of the best swords in the game, like, in just bar none. It's fantastic. It's amazing. So you don't want to keep that Golden Dagger on Saber forever. And he doesn't really need it, because Saber can use pretty much any sword in the game. And the secret swords, like the Ill Wound and the Zweihander, insane weapons that if you know how to make them, you can just turn somebody, especially in the early game like Saber, into an absolute monster, regardless of difficulty. Valbar, forgettable. Leon, forgettable. Kamui, forgettable. I am halfway tempted to put Est in forgettable. I'm not going to necessarily do that, but I would say that Valbar, Leon, and Kamui are forgettable. Typically, I don't even bother recruiting these units. Not kidding. I just let them die in the chapter that they're in. And it's because they're not good. They're not useful. There's nothing that you're going to gain by these units. You're not gaining anything from Leon, even though he's basically the only Bowknight you're getting in Celica's route, unless you decide to promote Atlas that way. And because Atlas is the villager in this route, Valbar is a knight in a very magic-based route. There's much less physical damage and much more magical damage in Celica's route than there was in Alm's route. Valbar is just an instant bench, even if I did recruit him. Leon is literally worthless. I hate his entire character. His entire character foil. I hate everything about like his combat, his utility. It's just not any good or useful. I don't like the way that they made his character look in this game. I really don't like the little girly dance he does in his combat. Kamui is like stereotypical Rock Lee and Brock, and like not a good unit. You could eventually make him good. In fact, I'd say he's the only one of these three that could eventually become good, because he can become a Dread Fighter. I don't think it's that useful. I really don't. Pala and Katria. Both of these are going to go into A tier. Est is going to go in C tier. So Pala and Katria are very strong, and they are very close to being able to be promoted. And once they are, they have the capacity to be even stronger, especially against terrors, because they get the plus 10 might in this game. Now, Slayer is not as strong as it is in Gaiden, because Gaiden just makes it so that all of their weapons are always effective, triple effective against terrorists. In this game, they just get a plus 10 damage. That's both good and not good at the same time. So I would still say that it's a good skill. And if you do get the triangle attack skill and stuff like that, they can become very powerful in their own right, all three of these particular units. Est is just got the worst start, though she has a very good growth potential. Typically, I don't use her. I kind of just throw her to the side, bench her kind of deal. Now, when it comes to Sonya, I think she's B tier. She actually has some really cool utility in her magic. She's actually one of the few units that learns Entrap. She actually learns Rewarp and Entrap. This is something that is particular to her. Rewarp and Entrap is basically what the witches do to you, except again, she cannot move after she rewarps, so it's kind of like not as good utility. She does learn Seraphim if you take her down the cleric route, but the problem is you have to reclass her with a pitchfork in order to get her to that point, which is just not worth it, right? You're basically taking her down a whole nother range. As a sage, she is a very good unit, especially with something akin to like the steel shield that she does have. Having more defense on her is pretty good because what she's lacking is defense. She's actually pretty good resistively, and magically she's going to be one of your stronger damage dealing units. The reason why I don't put her in A tier is just because you already have tons of magical units. Celica is the best magical unit in the game concerning magical damage. Celica also has Seraphim alongside a lot of these other really powerful magical attacks. So Sonya is kind of like a cool side character, but you have to make a choice. And the choice is kind of sometimes hard because I think that Dean is a very good unit, especially since he is so close to being a dread fighter himself. Next is Conrad. Conrad is the brother of Celica. A little bit of a hidden note in the game. I think he's a B tier. I think he's above average, not exactly mediocre. He's a good unit. He's kind of like fulfilling the place of Matilda in Celica's party, except he's not as good as Matilda in my humble opinion. I still think he's good, and he's definitely useful for what you have him, but he's not what I would call necessary in Celica's party, which kind of begs the question, like, why is he, here? He's a paladin that comes very late into the game. Very late. I'm pretty sure he's the very last recruit that Celica's party partakes in. Atlas is next. So Atlas is the only villager that Celica's route has, and because of this, I'm going to put him in B tier. There have been times where I've thought he was a C or a D tier unit, and the reason why that is because he is just a villager. But if you want a Bow Knight relatively quick, I think Atlas is the best option. Of course, there is Leon, but again, I don't care for Leon. I typically just bench him, even if I do recruit him, but I typically don't recruit him. I don't think that Atlas is all that bad, but I feel like the only way to make him viable is to make him a Bow Knight. You get so many accesses to Dread Fighters in both Alm's route and Celica's route. Alm's route has all of the villagers, whereas Celica's route has Saber, Kamui, Jesse, Dean. These all are on a straight path to Dread Fighter. And speaking of Jesse, I would say that he's a C tier. And the only reason why I'm putting him in C tier is because he is a bit of a late recruit, but like I said, he can become a Dread Fighter. Once his potential is reached, it's very good. It's the same thing with Kamui. If you were to reach Kamui's potential of being a Dread Fighter, he eventually becomes very good as a Dread Fighter. I just don't think that's enough. I think that with the early recruitment of Saber has the best position in Celica's party to be one of your better units. Let alone the fact that I actually find, like I said, Dread Fighters are good, but I actually don't find them anywhere near as good as Bow Knights. Now, Dean is a pre-promote that I believe is worthy of A tier. And the reason why he's worthy of A tier is because he is pretty much just as good as Saber would be by the time you get Dean. And Dean is also very close to being able to be a Dread Fighter himself. I think that Dean is a very good replacement. My problem with Fire Emblem 15, with Shadows of Valentia Echoes itself, is again the party size limit of 10 in the final dungeons and stuff like that, or any of the dungeons. So you can use 10 units on Alm's party and you can use 10 units in Celica's party, but once those two parties convene, it's impossible to use more than 10 in the dungeons. So you're just stuck with this issue of you have like too many units to move. Not only too many units to move on a regular map, but also too many units to use, this, that, and the other, blah, blah, blah. It's just too much. Honestly, it's just too much. And because of this, I oftentimes find myself just benching a lot of units that you would automatically think is good. There are times where, like, for instance, I've used Saber a bunch, but I know that I can't afford 2 Dread Fighters in my final roster because I'm only going to have 5 parties from Celica's route, 5 units from Celica's route, or 5 units from Alm's route. Or, for instance, maybe I'll train, like, a bunch of units in both routes, but I really want to take, like, 8 of the 10 units from Alm's route, and I do that oftentimes because Alm, Tobin, Gray, Cliff, Faye, Tatiana, and Silk, that's 7 units right there, and I really think all 7 of those are perfectly viable for the spot, especially because having 3 Bone Knights is insane. In fact, more often than not, I typically go with a party I just mentioned, and then I would have like Celica, Saber, and then maybe Sonya, and that's my party. That's literally the end-all be-all of my party. And finally, Noma. Noma is supposed to be the Goto of this game, and unfortunately, I'm going to put him in B tier. Above average, he's not necessarily mediocre, but he is nothing to the extent of like a Goto, or definitely nothing powerful like Athos. He is good for what he offers. He has good utility. He's basically just a good mage. He has good attacks, but only recover. Recover is his only staff that he has. It's kind of actually very weird because Noma is supposed to be the Goto of the game. The Goto of the game is typically somebody who can use like every good staff, every good magic, this, that, or the other, is very powerful. Not like technically your most powerful unit, but he's gonna help you with the final chapter and so on and so forth. Noma doesn't really fit that in reality. He is that archetype, right? He's the old wise man with the magic to boot. He's high level. He's a pre-promote. He's one of your last recruits. But would you ever consider Noma as good as Ced in Thracia? And the moment that I bring up Ced is the moment that you have to kind of say like, well, definitely not. Ced is the best Goto in the entire franchise in Thracia. And that's because he gets the best home in the entire franchise relative to his own game. So Noma has to go in B tier because he's just not fulfilling enough of that space for me to say that I would put him anything above this. I think my tier list is a little bit flawed. And the reason why I'll say it's a little bit flawed is because it's how I'm thinking about the game in terms of the length of the game, how long it takes to level certain units. If I were to rank this tier list based on units I use, like I said, it would basically be Alm, Tobin, Gray, Cliff, Faye, Tatiana, Silk, Celica, Sonya, and Saber. Those would be the only units I'd use. They'd collectively run an S tier and A tier, and everybody else would be below. And I would just make B tier forgettable, and everybody would be in B tier. The only problem with that is that when I think about that, even of the units that I don't use, there are still units worth using. So that's why I would put Dean. I'd put Paula. I'd put Katria. I'd put Matilda, Mycen in A tier. I'd put Zeke in S tier. Because even though oftentimes I don't find myself using these units, I understand their value. So trying to come at this with a little bit less of a biased view, I'm trying to say, like, yeah, these units are still good for what they offer. There's probably some of these that are a little bit of a hot take, like for instance Luther. A lot of people love Luther. He's in many people's eyes, he is like the Sorin or the beginning mage or Asvel, so on and so forth. I don't think he fits that. I actually think Delphia fits that better than he does, but still doesn't really fit that. I don't really think that there are good mages in any of Alm's route. Of course, there are good clerics, but there's not good mages. And that's just because there's a lot of mages in Celica's route. So they tried to balance it where Alm's route is dealing with more physical enemies and you have more physical units, and then Celica's route has more magical enemies and you have more magical units. And you also have way more healers in Alm's route, because in Celica's route, every magical unit can eventually at least use Recover, and some of them even get Physic. So you only get Jenny. She is the only, literally only dedicated healer in Celica's route. But Alm gets 3. It's actually kind of interesting the way that this game is balanced, and it's a little bit of a flip on its head compared to other games. With that being said, though, this is my FE15 Shadows of Valentia Echoes tier list. I think that it's relatively accurate to where I would put the units if I were just objectively looking at the units themselves at recruitment. Remember, this is at recruitment, at time of recruitment, with availability in mind. Because like I said, I actually think Bow Knights are the best unit in the game, except for the fact that I put every last one of the Bow Knights either in B tier or D tier. So Python and Leon are the only units that are bow units to start, and both of them are in D tier. But I put Tobin, Gray, Cliff, and Atlas in B tier. And the reason why this is because, again, it has to do with how they are at recruitment, how far in the game they are at recruitment, and availability, such stuff like that, utility. So that's pretty much my thought and my purpose behind that. When I was looking at the overall list, I wanted to really stress the importance of your units being good at base. And then if they're not good at base, they have to have something that is really fantastic to work towards. Like for instance, Silk's Invoke and Expel, as well as the fact that she has Physic and other things like that that really make her a very fantastic healing and supportive unit. Because I value the healers in this game more than I value the physical attackers in this game. I just do. It's not that they're a better class combatively, because nothing's beating the Bow Knight, but it's just that they offer so darn much. Faye is a perfect example of this. Tatiana's a perfect example of this. You only have one access to Anu, you only have one access to Fortify. Why wouldn't you use both of those? Even if you're not going to use Silk. These two units are just absolute must-haves on your team. Celica, unfortunately, is the only S tier in her entire group, in her entire part. And the reason why that has to be is because everybody else in her party is kind of just like a means to an ends, if I'm being honest. Celica's group has a bunch of units that I will use to support Celica's way until she unites with Alm. Because Alm's party, in my humble opinion, is the main party. And it's the way I treat Echoes in itself. One of these days, I'm going to get around to a Shadows of Valentia playthrough. And when I do, I think that's going to be a really fun time. A really fun time. It'll be very interesting and probably a little bit bow spammy. And if you were expecting anything other than that, you were going to be sadly mistaken, because I'm obviously going to use bows in the game where bows are the best. I do want to thank you for joining me, though. If you like my content, please vote and follow, or like and subscribe, depending on your platform. Leave a comment down below. Tell me how you think I did, and whether or not you agree or disagree with my tier list. Tier lists are oftentimes very subjective, regardless of how objective you're trying to be. And the reason why that is because there are units you like to use, there are units that you would prefer to use, and there are just like different parameters that allow for a different list to go by. Because if you were talking about end game potential of all these units, rather than just what I was talking about, which is at the beginning where they're recruited, so on and so forth, some of these units would have to be higher and some of these units would have to be lower. But as it stands, this is how I'm rating my list. And with all that being said, have a great and glorious day gaming.